We're delighted to be partnering with the National Museum of the Great Lakes Speakers Bureau to bring this topic to you tonight. We were inspired by Talk Like a Pirate Day, which was September 19, but we are celebrating all week at the library with drop-in activities, including a treasure hunt. Say pirate, and most of us will picture swashbuckling rogues burying treasure in the Caribbean, making prisoners walk the plank, and saying "arr" a lot. So you might be surprised to learn that piracy lent its unsavory shadow to Great Lakes history too. Much more to come on that shortly. It is now my honor to introduce our presenter. Christopher Gillcrist is Executive Director of the National Museum of the Great Lakes in Toledo, Ohio. He has a BA and MA in History from John Carroll University and his ABD in Social Policy at Case Western Reserve University. He has served as Associate Professor of History at Notre Dame College of Ohio and Instructor of History at Ursuline College. Prior to his current duties, he served as Executive Director of the Lake County Historical Society. Christopher Gillcrist, welcome.
There we go. Thank you, Catherine. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to your library patrons and look forward to any questions that they might have on what is, I think, a fun and interesting topic. Okay, I am going to share my screen. Before I start, I'm going to, let me just give you a little bit of, besides the bio about the National Museum of the Great Lakes. The parent organization is the Great Lakes Historical Society. We've been around since 1945. Our mission is to preserve and make known the history of the Great Lakes, and we do that by operating a museum in Toledo. So if any of your patrons wish to, they're headed east for something and they're on the Ohio Turnpike, please feel free. We're 9 miles north of the Turnpike in Toledo, Ohio, and you're all welcome to come out and see our museum and our 2 museum ships that we have. We also publish a journal, a quarterly journal, Inland Seas, which is subscribed to by about, I'm going to say about 1,800 people in 47 states and 3 countries. We do educational programs like this and for adults and children as well. And we also do underwater archaeology. So we find shipwrecks, we survey them. We have brought one thing. The state of Ohio allowed us to bring one artifact up from a wreck we found in Lake Erie. And so we are a shipwreck exploration group as well. So we're going to talk about piracy tonight, and I'm going to share my screen. And that should be, there we go. Arg, not your typical pirate, the Great Lakes and piracy. So what we're going to do today, what we hope to accomplish in today's lecture is appreciate how culture has warped our understanding of piracy, because I think piracy has kind of been romanticized over the last 150 years. This program helps sort of bring it back to what piracy is really about, to understand, and it also because piracy is really a phenomena, at least historically, the Caribbean and the Atlantic, to understand how that piracy came about and dominates our understanding of the topic, and then to bring the Great Lakes into it and see if there are similarities and differences between the two. And I think you'll find that there are some interesting both similarities, but also interesting differences that are based on the history, the geography, and the chronology of when piracy took place, really in the Atlantic in the 17th and 18th and early 19th century. All right. So we're going to explore the kind of parameters of what piracy is. Now, if we take a a kind of a traditional approach to piracy. It is the practice of attacking and robbing ships at sea, and ultimately often taking possession of the boat itself. But it's specifically in maritime law, the traditional definition is the attacking and robbing of ships at sea. I'm going to, for the purposes of this discussion, sort of broaden that definition to talk about piracy being illegal activity that occurs all or in part or is made possible by some connection to maritime activity. So it's illegal things that happen on the sea and on the open waters. And so it's a little bit more liberal definition of what piracy is, but it allows us then to play the Atlantic experience off of the Great Lakes experience a little bit more effectively. Now, if we talk about the cultural appropriation of piracy that's been going on for many years, Robert Louis Stevenson in the 1880s wrote Treasure Island, kind of a dime store or a dime penny novel that was whole purpose was to excite people and really truly entertain as opposed to have any real basis in history. That process continued, of course, with Disney. Disney and Peter Pan and Captain Hook and all of that. Disney, interestingly, invested $4 million into Peter Pan and came away with an $85 million profit on the Peter Pan story. And so piracy, when you add the profit mode in there, the historical aspects of piracy become something less important, and the entertainment and profitability mode become more significant. And that clearly can be seen in that cultural experience. The Pirates of Penzance, Gilbert and Sullivan, 1915. Once again on Broadway. So live performance, literature, this thing called cinematography or in cartooning, are different ways that piracy has been experienced by generation after generation after generation of people in the 20th and in the 20th century. The big screen, the silver screen, Errol Flynn and Cutthroat Island. Errol Flynn, one of the huge actors of the first 50 years of Hollywood in the 20th century. But even bigger than Errol Flynn, of course, Johnny Depp and the Pirates of the Caribbean. Pirates of the Caribbean has grossed over $1.25 billion. And these are, this is just a quick story. My mother, God rest her soul, used to send $1 once a month to an organization that she thought was going to get smut off the TV. And I said, why are you doing this? Nobody really watches TV. Nobody really cares about what's on TV. Doesn't influence anybody. But when push comes to shove, and you begin to really look at it, a lot of people are impacted by what they see and hear on TV, and in all cultural activities. And so it is so our whole notion of piracy, I think generation after generation in the 20th century and even today, is influenced by these representations of piracy. And these representations are often romanticized. Jack Sparrow comes across as this very self-centered, but also kind of lovable character. Errol Flynn, same sort of thing. Captain Hook may be the bad guy in Disney, but they great purveyors of culture like the Disney Corporation often are able to create pathos and empathy for even the bad characters. And so we really have an experience in which people have I think in many ways developed a distorted view of what piracy is, because piracy, in the strict definition, is robbing a vessel at sea by another vessel, and in a broad definition, it encompasses so much more. And those things that it encompasses are things like human trafficking, murder, theft, all the deadly sins, so to speak. And it's a the vast majority of pirates were actually very bad people, and they did terrible things. And so our goal here is to illustrate some of that nature of what it truly was, and kind of take back from the cultural world what they have been able to influence, so that we have a better and a more realistic understanding of what piracy was actually like, both on the Atlantic and on the Great Lakes. Okay. So when we start talking about the Atlantic experience in the 17th and 18th century, piracy is made possible by a number of factors. And the first factor has been largely taken away, and it's why piracy has become, although it is still practiced, it certainly isn't practiced in a significant way right now in the traditional sense on the Atlantic Ocean. It's in other places, off the coast of Africa, in the Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea, other places, but the lack of control, either by a nation and in the context of colonial life, by an empire, or the British Empire, the Great Britain, and later by the United States, the lack of control of waterways, meaning their ability to patrol them. The ocean was vast, and so the ability to be a pirate and to not be under constant scrutiny. They didn't have drones, they didn't have satellites, they didn't have any of the technology that we have that prevent that type of activity from flourishing. And so the waterways were, the oceans were both, outside of the traditional 7 miles off the coast, were free and clear of activity. We also didn't have, in the 17th and 18th century, any international organization that provides structure towards the implementation of maritime law and the enforcement of maritime law. And so we don't have United Nations rules and regulations, and World Court rules and regulations as to maritime law. And so that the fact that it was kind of, think of the Atlantic Ocean in the 17th and 18th century as kind of like the wild, wild west, where you couldn't control it. It was so big and expansive. There weren't enough sheriffs out there. And that's one reason why it flourished in such a significant way. Part of this was aided and abetted by the national governments of the day, Great Britain, Spain, the Netherlands, Portugal, France as well, who used privateers. And a privateer is a private citizen who will often have a vessel. They're engaged in commerce, and they receive a commission when there's a war going on. It's a way to build your navy without actually building a navy. So in Great Britain, the king or the queen would issue letters of marque that would, to a private, the right in case of war. Why would he do this? Because the king said it was okay to do, and because he was able to take a certain percentage of what he captured in terms of value. So it becomes a profit model. And so privateers were really often the first pirates. Now, they were legal when they were operating under their commission. The commission was usually during times of war. Those commissions expired either by date or by the establishment of peace between two countries. And so the real problem begins when what happens when the two countries make peace and the war ends. These privateers had really gotten very wealthy on being a pirate and engaging in this activity. And so they often will continue that activity without their commission, which makes them now illegal pirates and encourages the activity. This is all driven, though, in the Atlantic and going back even a little bit before the 17th century into the 16th century by having a reason to be a pirate, and that is there is money to be made. Whether it's in war or in peace, there is money to be made because there is great wealth coming out of North America, Central America, and South America, particularly Central America and South America with respect to gold and silver. And so, if you take away the profit model, if you take away the motivation for this, piracy tends to go away. But if there is money to be made, people will go to extreme activities to have access to that type of wealth. And so, if you look at, for example, I'm sure many of your guests or some of them may have seen the Mel Fisher Museum down in Florida, which he brought up stuff from a shipwreck, and it was from the Spanish Main, and big blocks of gold were brought up. That's what inspired piracy outside of the idea of a commission of war, privateers. So there has to be a financial reason to do it, and then the opportunity to do it. And these were all available on the Atlantic in the 17th and 18th centuries. All right. So when we look at the Great Lakes and we compare the Atlantic experience and the experience of the Great Lakes, there are some obvious differences. So when we talk about timelines, the Great Lakes is populated at a much later date than the 16th and 17th and or early 18th into the 18th and 19th century. The Great Lakes really, yes, we have on the Great Lakes, we have Jesuits doing missionary work in the 17th century, but you don't have the financial activity going on, the trade that's going on until much later. So if when we talk about the Atlantic trade that is going on, that's really happening in the 16th and 17th century in significant amounts, as well as into the 18th century. We don't get that until really almost the mid 19th century, and so because of that, piracy, which becomes much less acceptable, much less used by governments in terms of letters of marque and privateers. When the Great Lakes really truly develops its wealth, the governments aren't doing that. And so the lawless period of the Great Lakes, there wasn't much out there. So there wasn't much of a need financially to drive. There wasn't the financial motivation to involve oneself in the type of scale of activity that was occurring on the Atlantic. And so, yes, there was a sense of lawlessness because the Great Lakes were the frontier, but that comes much later, and it simply just doesn't follow the pattern that we see in the Atlantic and Caribbean. Privateers, that really the idea of in fact, the idea of a privateer was dying out by the time the wealth was discovered on the Great Lakes to make it practical. And so, and in the United States, when our Constitution is created, there are things like the Constitution forbids the president or Congress from issuing titles of nobility. There are restrictions on individual activity that a king really did not have restrictions upon. And we had a national army and a national navy, so there was no need for this type of activity. They did do privateers in the U.S. The War of 1812, but the battles that were fought in the War of 1812 on the Great Lakes were not fought by privateers. They were fought by the United States Navy. And so we don't get that type of activity on the Great Lakes. So for practical purposes, we never saw piracy evolve out of that privateer problem that occurs on the Atlantic in the 17th and 18th century. And then, of course, geography. The Great Lakes are not a closed system, but it's real hard to get into the Great Lakes. You've got to sail all the way up and come down the St. Lawrence, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, down the St. Lawrence River, and go against the current because the water is flowing out to the ocean. And with sailing vessels, that makes it hard. And so, and once you're on the Great Lakes, we have a saying on the Great Lakes that you can run, but you can't hide, because even though that they are this vast inland sea, as we call them, the reality is that it is a relatively closed system, and which doesn't. It's not a fundamentally hospitable place, because as the region becomes more and more populated, there becomes less and less places to hide. And so if we look at the Atlantic in the 17th and 18th century, even when we look at the Great Lakes in the early 19th century, Lake Superior is big, but it's not the Atlantic Ocean. And so piracy as an illegal activity needs to have that anonymity, needs to have those places where you can escape to and hide out. And that's much harder to do on the Great Lakes as we get into the 19th century. The simple by the mid 1850s, we had telegraph, which allowed you to alert people from city to city to city. That changes the nature of being able to hide a boat. So the geography and timeline simply doesn't work well, and it's why piracy, as we understand it, know it, really flourishes in the Atlantic in the 17th and 18th century, but is only in that classical sense of a pirate, is in a limited way on the Great Lakes. But let's look at some of the things that happen on the Great Lakes in that broad definition of illegal activity related to the water. We did have this great battle. Our last major battle on the Great Lakes is, of course, the War of 1812 and the Battle of Lake Erie in 1813. This ends that national competition for the Great Lakes. And as I said, timeline-wise, before 1813, there's not enough on the Great Lakes to get a person to be a pirate, because there's not that much commercial shipping traffic to steal. Now that takes off in the 19th century, and we have plenty of traffic. But after that, by the time we're in the 19th century, the limits to piracy on so many different levels don't allow that traditional sense of piracy, but do allow ultimately for that liberal, broad sense of piracy of illegal activity. We mention this also because the Great Lakes really were only available for the vast majority after the French are removed after the 7 Years' War. it's only two countries that are controlling the Great Lakes, Great Britain and then the United States when we get our independence. And so once again, in the Caribbean, it's open to everyone versus the Great Lakes being sort of a restricted area. And so we don't see it for that reason. But we also never give up the opportunity to point out that the Battle of Lake Erie, the most important naval battle in American history between the American Revolution and the Battle of Midway in World War II, was an American victory, and it is the only time an entire British naval squadron has ever been captured. And we just like to point that out because it makes us happy. The other let's see, idea of this piracy is what we call contested allegiance, and that is the Civil War. And here we actually get something, one of the few instances of what we call that traditional piracy, and that is for those of you who don't realize, during the Civil War, a little place, and I'm not sure if you can see my pointer, a little island called Johnson Island in Sandusky Bay on Lake Erie is a Confederate prisoner of war camp. There were several hundred Confederate officers who were placed on a small island in the middle of Sandusky Bay, about 3 miles from shore. And they were housed there for several years. As the Civil War progressed and the South began to feel the impact of the loss of qualified and experienced officers, they hatched an idea to have a Confederate sympathizer, Mr. Beale, find a way to get those prisoners off that island, free them, so they could wreak havoc on places like Ohio and Michigan, and add to the war effort on the part of the South. The plan was for Mr. Beale to come down from Canada to take control with he and his Confederates to take control of a little steamer called the Island Queen, which would go from Sandusky, Ohio, out to the Lake Erie Islands. They would seize control of that boat, use it to come aside a major naval vessel, the USS Michigan. The USS Michigan was the first iron vessel built in the United States Navy. They would take control of the USS Michigan, bring it up to Johnson Island, and the USS Michigan was at that point stationed over in the western end of Lake Erie, near Sandusky Bay. They would take the USS Michigan, bring it to Johnson Island, free the Confederate prisoners at Johnson Island. Some of the officers would come on board and serve as the crew of the USS Michigan, now under Confederate control, which would then go up and down the coastline, bombing Ohio and Michigan cities, wreaking havoc. This kind of a big, glorious, and interesting plan, which was better on paper than it was in actual operational experiences. The plan quickly failed. The Confederate sympathizers and Mr. Beale quickly were chased off. The USS Michigan not captured. The Island Queen held for a period of the fact that the Island Queen was taken for a brief time, taking control by these Confederates, was one of these first acts of what we would call traditional piracy on the Great Lakes. Interestingly enough, the USS Michigan, which was the first naval vessel, iron naval vessel in the U.S. Navy fleet. That boat itself, we'll see later pictures of it under another context. But that boat lasted all the way up until the 1920s before it was decommissioned. All right. Philo Parsons, this was another boat that was going to be involved in this scheme on the part of the Confederate raiders. And there is the USS Michigan, a side wheel iron vessel built in Erie, Pennsylvania in 1842 that stopped this activity. So tax evasion. And we put this in here because tax evasion was not what we think about it today. We think about tax evasion today as people not paying their taxes on their income. But you have to understand, between the founding of the Republic in 1787, 1788, when we passed the Constitution, and up until the income tax was passed, the principal source of revenue for the United States government was not income tax, but tariffs. Tariffs on goods imported from other countries. So when we start talking about tax evasion in the 19th century, we're talking about people who try to sneak goods into the United States and sell them without paying the duty at the port that they bring them into. Now, because up until 1867, Canada is part of Great Britain, and then it is a independent country, Dominion status, after 1867. That meant any good that was brought in from what we call Canada had to get a tax on it. That's what funded our government. The problem is that it was really easy to bring stuff over from Canada into the United States and not pay taxes on it. So one of the things, the first actual, and this is not just on the Great Lakes, but everywhere in the US government, the first naval branch of the government that was formed was not the United States Navy. It was something called the Revenue Service, the Internal Revenue Service. And the Revenue Service was the agency that was charged with collecting taxes and enforcing that tariffs be paid. And they established the Revenue Cutter Service, and they built boats for, at that time, the Atlantic and Gulf Mexico. And when the Great Lakes began to become populated, they built both revenue cutters that were sailing vessels in the 1830s and 1840s, and then also revenue cutters that were steamers that were built later for the sole purpose of enforcing tax law in the United States, but here on the Great Lakes. And because of the Great Lakes geography, this was the easiest place to bring goods in into the United States without paying taxes. And so it was rampant. And in fact, often the USS Michigan, truly a naval vessel, not a revenue cutter, was often kind of given in peacetime non-military activity, such as doing revenue cutter service to stop the illegal importation of goods on water into the United States. And so this was extremely common in the 19th century, probably one of the most common forms of illegal activity on the water, made possible by the close proximity to Canada. And we had any number of vessels, probably from 6 vessels to 18 vessels at any given time on the Great Lakes, patrolling the border, attempting to stop this illegal activity from occurring. And so piracy as the broad example of illegal activity on water, tax evasion being one of the most common in the 19th century. Simple thievery. If you take our historians will look at documents, and we'll look at police reports, and we'll look at newspapers, and simple thievery is so common in the 19th century in the ports of all Great Lakes cities: Cleveland, Toledo, Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, just to name a few. It was endemic, and those, because you have to understand the amount of goods that were coming in to these ports, that were traded between ports, that were brought, manufactured goods that were brought west on the Erie Canal and the Ohio and Erie Canal up from the Ohio River, were brought into the Great Lakes and then shipped by boat, and they're delivered to ports, and they're taken off the boats, and they're sitting in the wharf, and simple illegal activity, coming in and taking that material off of the dock illegal, stealing it, putting it on other boats, taking it out of the port, taking it to another port and selling it. This was a huge problem on the Great Lakes. And it was one of the reasons why the insurance industry moved so quickly to the Great Lakes in terms of providing coverage, not only for vessels, but for the material that they were shipping. Lloyd's of London begins insuring Great Lakes vessels as an underwriter in the 1850s, 1860s. And they have so many problems with insuring cargo and insuring the boats themselves because of all of the theft that was taking place. In the 1880s, they finally said enough is enough, and they actually Lloyd's of London opens an office in Cleveland, Ohio, because they got to get a handle on this, because they're paying too much out in insurance premiums on theft of goods. And you can read article after article in the local newspapers about things that are stolen off the docks. It was like open season. Now, if we jump forward about 30 years into the 20th century, this activity actually changes in its nature, because in most American cities, certainly on the Great Lakes, La Cosa Nostra, the Italian mob, begins to rise to the top of the criminal syndicate world. And in fact, ports and controlling the goods and stealing goods in ports becomes a major source of mob revenue, both on the East Coast, but also on the Great Lakes. And this goes all the way up until more recent times, the 1960s, 1970s. In Cleveland, Ohio in the 1970s became what is known as the Bomb City, USA, because rival families were fighting over Cleveland. And in fact, one, he was an outsider, as he was an Irishman, who Denny Green, who was tied to the mob, a wise guy, so to speak. He went to war against the mob because they were trying to cut in to his illegal control of the port of Cleveland and his ability to steal anything that came into the city of Cleveland by boat. And so this illegal activity, once again, in the general sense of being on or near connected to water, stealing of things that were in the port, in that general sense, we think of as piracy, was huge on the Great Lakes. Another example, insurance fraud or the sinking of vessels. Once again, an illegal activity. The Nevada, and this is just a story that it's near and dear to my heart. because my one of my board members um, uh, asked me about this boat called Nevada. And he said, "Can you look up some information on it?" And it turned out this board member bid at one of our fundraisers. An artist, a marine artist, said he will donate the use of his skills to paint a ship portrait for anybody who pays a certain amount of money. And my board member did it and won this. And he wanted to have a painting of this steamer from the 1880s, lasted about 15 years on the Great Lakes. And he wanted to have a painting of it because his family had a partial interest in it. They were part owners of it in the early 1890s. And so we did the research to give him information on this boat, the Nevada. And it turns out that the Nevada sank, and it didn't sink in a terrible storm. It didn't sink in an explosion. It sank because somebody sank it. Somebody pulled the plug on it and let it sink because it was worth more in insurance money than it was as a functioning vessel. So when I went to my board member and said, "Here's your painting, and by the way, here's the history of the boat," that the owners of the boat in 1894 were brought up under federal court, were indicted and brought up on insurance fraud. And he laughed, and I was a little concerned that he would be offended, but he laughed and said, "Every family has a horse thief, and he's glad that he has his." But insurance fraud, and you would be shocked to know how many boats are on the bottom of the Great Lakes that were purposefully sunk. Not only commercial vessels, but probably more so in more recent years, which is people who buy a boat and buy it with a bank note loan, and then really don't want to pay the monthly installment, and they end up committing insurance fraud. And my archaeologist has said, "Oh yeah, we find pleasure boats on the bottom of Lake Erie all the time." And so even today, that sort of thing, that illegal activity, using the water as part of your illegal activity, is still a common experience. Now, timber pirates, once again, 19th and 20th century was actually a huge problem. So timber was shipped on the Great Lakes going back all the way to the 1820s, 1830s. And in fact, before we developed steel technology to build cities, the first kind of building material was wood. The second one was stone or brick. And often, even if you built a stone building, it had wood involved in its construction. And the Michigan, the Upper Peninsula, Wisconsin, Minnesota, they became these really huge suppliers of timber. And how it was transported, and I believe I have a little photograph here that's kind of cool. There is a mule team taking logs from the place where they were cut. And what they do is they take them on sled down to a riverway. And on the riverway, they would put them in a chain controlled area, drive them down a river out into the open lake, where then a tugboat would come in and connect a line to the chained brood of timber, and it would haul it to a nearby timber mill, where it would then be turned into planks of wood. So this little tugboat you're seeing is pulling thousands and thousands of board feet of timber, very valuable timber. Now, part of the problem is that often it would be several days before the timber would make its way down the river. It wasn't always people found a lucrative way of slipping in, essentially stealing the timber by doing exactly what the owners would do once they got it out onto the lake. They're just not coming back for a week, and the thieves would come in and steal the timber, run it to a sawmill, and once it's at the sawmill, the timber isn't branded. There's no identifying characteristics. It was impossible for people to manage this and be able to stop the proliferation of timber thievery. So timber pirates were actually common, so common that that became, in post-Civil War era, 1865 to about 1890, the most common activity of the USS Michigan on the Great Lakes was going after timber pirates, because it became a huge problem, because as we begin to industrialize as a country, we still need the materials of wood for building construction, and the supply chains began to become impacted, more so by the fact that we couldn't get investment into timber harvesting because timber piracy was so common. And so people didn't want to invest in businesses that did this for a living, because they had chances of huge runs of timber being stolen and essentially processed on the black market without repaying the investors. So timber piracy became something of significant that the federal government, and that's one of the great differences between what we think of as the responsibility of the state, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, on the Great Lakes, is that the Great Lakes are, because of Canada, they're an international waterway. And so the federal government actively involves itself in it. And so the USS Michigan, during times of peace, besides chasing tax evaders, was also used to suppress the timber piracy that was going on the Great Lakes. If we jump ahead to the 1930s, illegally transporting rum or any alcohol on the Great Lakes, or anywhere in the country from roughly 1919 to 1932 was illegal. And people think of rum running as an activity between the Bahamas and Florida. That's kind of where the rum running became identified. But in fact, about 85% of all illegal importation of alcohol into the United States during Prohibition came through the Great Lakes. And a huge percentage of that actually comes through the Detroit-Windsor funnel, which the proximity of Canada to Detroit made it just so simple and easy to bring huge amounts of alcohol across. Now, rum runners began with activity on the water. They would take boats over to Canada, fill them up with alcohol, bottles and kegs of alcohol, run across the river, or, in the case of Lake Erie or the Detroit River, and then run their boats up onto the beach and unload them and go back for another run. It was hugely profitable. And these rum running pirates began to invest money in their operations. Right after World War I, the United States government put a huge number of airplanes or airplane engines on sale, because the United States was downsizing their military after World War I. And so all of these airplanes that we had built were now being sold off. And rum runners would buy the airplanes and use the engines and put these engines in speedboats. And they really became very difficult to catch. Now, during the 1920s and the Prohibition period, the Coast Guard was one of the principal interdicting agencies that was designated to stop this illegal importation of alcohol. The Coast Guard would never have boats fast enough to catch the rum runners. And so eventually the Coast Guard said, you know what we have to do? They passed laws in order to make the Coast Guard more able to do its job correctly. And so the Coast Guard could seize property that was thought to be involved in rum running. Even though that they may not have found alcohol on it, they were able to seize property, and they went and seized a number of these speedboats, which when they weren't being used for rum running, were just sitting in, the port of Toledo or the port of Port Clinton or Lorraine or Cleveland. And the Coast Guard would seize these vessels because once they took ownership of them, they were then had vessels that they could then go after the high-speed boats as well. And so at that point, less alcohol was brought across by boat on the Great Lakes, and the people involved in the illegal importation of alcohol did things like they built a pipeline on the bottom of the Detroit River from a distillery in Windsor, Ontario, and then had the pipeline end right in a distribution facility in Detroit. Because there was just so much money to be made. And so rum running clearly, and there were pitched battles. This was not, because a lot of this was organized crime. The Coast Guard boats were fitted out with machine guns and small style cannons, and they fired at rum runners. So this was in that kind of in that vein of the traditional piracy and boats firing upon each other. Generally, the rum runners didn't fire at the Coast Guard. They just sped away and tried to get away as quickly as possible. But it really took on that elemental feeling of being a battle at sea that a pirate in a government boat might have had. Interestingly, the people don't realize that one of the great events that is over in your neck of the woods in Chicago, Illinois, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, one of the great events that defines the history of gang warfare in the United States. That occurs because of a shipment of Al Capone of illegal alcohol coming through Detroit was itself hijacked by another rival gang. And the rival gang paid for it with machine guns in a basement in Chicago, bringing us the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. So always a Great Lakes connection. Now, Dan Seavey is considered by many people to be the person that comes closest to being a pirate on the Great Lakes. And Dan Seavey, I think we've got a picture of him. Hold on. Here we go. Dan Seavey lived from the 1860s till late 1940s. He was not from the Great Lakes originally. He moved here. He began sailing at a very early age, like 13, 14 years old. And when he came to the Great Lakes, he continued that trade. And on the Great Lakes, you can move up the chain fairly quickly if you know what you're doing, if you're a skilled sailor. And Dan Seavey was. But by the age of about 35, so right around 1900, he began to involve himself in the seedier side of life on the water. And Dan Seavey began to be involved in activities that were considered illegal and therefore on the water, therefore in that general term, acting as a pirate. Dan Seavey was a timber thief. That was pretty common. He was a guy who thought nothing of sailing his boat, the Wanderer, into a port, seeing some cargo that had just been unloaded, and having his guys load up that cargo in the middle of the night from the dock, and taking off and selling it someplace else. Dan Seavey was a and this is I didn't talk about this because I just haven't been able to find enough information on it. He was known for being a venison thief, a poacher of venison. And I don't know if he's going on to other people's property to shoot deer and then sell the meat from it, or if that venison had already been perhaps not shot, but killed by a trap. We're still looking into this. But he was, and like many pirates, was charged numerous times during his life, but like many pirates, being able to wiggle out and come up with excuses for the illegal activity he was involved in. As I said, our goal here in one way is to disabuse ourselves of the idea that piracy was romantic. Dan Seavey, in modern terms, was a human trafficker. He kidnapped women and sold them into prostitution across the Great Lakes. Once again, that is something that happened in the Atlantic trade all the time. Piracy and prostitution were hand in hand, and it occurred here on the Great Lakes as well. Dan Seavey, though, there was an episode around 1908 that kind of really brought out the mystique of Dan Seavey as a pirate, and that is he actually pirates another person's boat. He takes a boat called the Nellie Johnson and sails it out of port, and he's on Lake Michigan. The owners decide that they contact the federal government and they say, our boat has been pirated. It's on Lake Michigan. The federal government brings in the revenue cutter service. I think we've got a picture of that as well. The Tuscarora is a revenue cutter that is operating on Lake Michigan. It is tasked with going and finding Dan Seavey and the Nellie Johnson. They run up the coast of Michigan, north in Lake Michigan, and finally the Tuscarora, with its steam power versus a sailing vessel, shoots shots across the Nellie Johnson's bow, and Dan Seavey surrenders and is arrested for piracy. So here we have an actual case of Dan Seavey and a case of what that classical definition of piracy. Dan Seavey was charged with piracy, but never convicted, as in the case of many pirates. And Dan, this was the story of his life. He concocted a story that he won the Nellie Johnson in a card game and that he was entitled to pick it up whenever he wanted it. It just so happened he picked it up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and that was immaterial to him. What happens in history is often that fact gets mixed with legend. Dan was not convicted of piracy. The individual decided not to show up for court. The reality is the owner got his boat back, and he may have said, I don't care, I'm done wasting more time on this. So Dan did not go to jail. Dan Seavey, these types of pirate type activities were common in his life. Another thing that he would do is something called the moon cussing, which is essentially going out and either changing navigational lights so that a ship would wreck on a uh, uh, somewhere close. So, he go out and salvage the wreck and take the goods illegally for himself. Um, and this was very common in his life. He ends his life also, though, being a federal officer. And I think at some point he was able to convince, and as some pirates seem to have, kind of an ability to entertain and to convince people that their activities are misunderstood. Um, Dan is able to get a commission as a deputy federal marshal, particularly probably because he said, "Listen, I know how it was all done, and I'm going to tell you how it's done, and I'll be helpful in that." And he lived out his last years on the government payroll before officially retiring. And so Dan Seavey is the closest thing we have to really a true pirate on the Great Lakes. Okay, that's my presentation. I'm happy to answer anybody's questions that they might have. I hope you found this interesting. It's I think, a fun way to explore a historical topic that you normally don't think about in terms of the Great Lakes, because they don't make multiple $1 million movies about Jack Sparrow on the Great Lakes.
Thanks so much, Chris. Does anyone have a question? Feel free to drop it in the comments there, or if you would like to raise your hand using the little Zoom tool, I can unmute you and you can ask your question out loud. We'll give it just oh, is pirating still occurring? Kathy asked.
So if we think, certainly in world waters, the Horn of Africa is piracy. Somalia, they once again, it's a for-profit model. They see a big ocean-going vessel and they sail out in motorboats. They have machine guns. They climb on board. They take ownership of the vessel, and then the owners of the vessel and insurance companies come up with a price tag that they're willing to pay to the pirates in order to get their boat turned back to them. So on a world stage, there are places where, once again, the U.S. Navy or other navies are just stretched too thin to protect every vessel at every point. And so, yes, it does occur. When we talk about, there are, well, I guess technically, we have a marina right adjacent to our museum in Toledo. And 2 years ago, several recreational boats were stolen out of there. I guess that's technically piracy. So that illegal activity will always happen anywhere. But the idea of a Dan Seavey taking a really a truly commercial vessel and stealing it and trying to, these commercial vessels all have GPS locators on them. So the technology in some ways makes a lot of this impractical. But we don't yet, and I say yet, and I pray that it never happens. We have not yet had a situation where people take control of a vessel and attempt to extort a ransom like they're doing in the Horn of Africa or over in Indonesia and other places. So illegal activity, yes. We don't bring too much illegal alcohol across from Canada, but an enterprising young guy put on a scuba suit over in Windsor and attached a rope to himself, attached to a really big cylindrical tube. This is about 5 years ago, and swam in the Detroit River underwater to the Detroit side, and the Coast Guard was waiting there for him, and they pulled the big tube out, and it was filled with like 1,200 pounds of marijuana. So yes, it does still happen, but illegal activity, but it's much harder to do in this day and age.
Speaking of logistics, I wondered, with the timber piracy, that seems like such a cumbersome thing to slip in there, attach your own tugboat to that thing and drag it off without getting caught. How did people even do that?
But part of it was because the timber operations, once again, this is in the 19th and early 20th century. They cut down. There's a kind of a camp of timber lumbermen who cut down the stuff. They put it in the river. They send it down, and they're off to the next forest. And then the company says, all right, we'll send somebody up with the tugboat, and we'll get it. It'll be down here in a day. And somebody is sort of watching and slips their boat in and takes it out. So it's very, the timber industry in places like Michigan and Wisconsin at the time, think of it like a wildcat operation where there's not an office, there's just a bunch of guys living in a camp, and that camp moves every couple of days. Once they cut down enough trees in this area, they're on to the next region. And those gaps of coverage in the 19th and early 20th century were much more common than we would think of something today, because that timber was, if we think of valuable cargo, that timber was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so the value of the product didn't necessarily, until it became a huge problem, didn't necessarily inspire people to figure out ways to protect it from point A to point C. So it was, and you have to remember, as we talk about the frontier in American history, certainly the frontier is the Great Lakes in the 17th, in the 17th and 18th century. In the 19th, the frontier is moving west past Chicago and out into the Great Plains. But until these states get a population big enough where the systems of governmental authority really truly are in place to enforce these types of issues and control these types of activities, the Great Lakes, and even in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, there are some parts of the Great Lakes that you can't get to. It's really, really frontier-like. And so that absence of regular government authority breeds illegal activity.
Thank you. So I'm going to give it about 10 more seconds. If anyone has another question, this is your last chance. And if you happen to be watching on Facebook, feel free to drop a question in the comments and we can read it out here. Well, it looks like you answered all the questions. Really, really informative and interesting tonight. Thank you so much.
It was my pleasure, and for your patrons and people who use the Chillicothe Library, please, on your next trip east, stop by Toledo. Not only do we have the National Museum of the Great Lakes, but we have Tony Packo's Hot Dog Emporium, made famous by the TV show MASH in the 1970s and 1980s, and a great place to come to. So please come visit Toledo. You'll have a great time.
So I think in the follow-up email, there's a link to the museum website, so people will be able to see that. The recording for tonight will be up on our Facebook page and YouTube in the next day or two. If you want to revisit any part of this or share it with others. And when you do leave the event tonight, there'll be a little 2-question survey if you want to leave some feedback about this program or suggestions for future programs. We'd really appreciate that. So thank you again for tuning in tonight, and Chris for presenting And I hope everyone has a lovely evening.